I don't necessarily think that like using rude, mean insults is something like we should be doing, but I would argue that like, for example, insulting someone for like being short, I would say would like possibly do more harm than like insulting someone for being white, because like there are actually times where short people have like systemic disadvantages and like white people really don't usually have systemic disadvantages.
So the way that I typically approach this kind of conversation is I agree to some extent, but what I argue is I don't think individuals experience systems. I think that like systems clash with systems, and an individual can have an experience like inside of a system, but I don't think an individual can experience an entire system. So when we start talking about like some word can or cannot have power because of systems, I think that words are said at like an individual level, and I think that they're felt at an individual level, and then I think when we start assuming that individuals can experience an entire system or an entire class, I think that academically maybe it feels like a good argument, but on Earth, or like when we look at individual humans, people don't interpret things that way.
Yeah, I don't think a person can like experience a system, but I think the way the system is set up can influence the amount of harm that a certain word does. And I think that like calling someone who is in a more disadvantaged position a slur can also help perpetuate that negative system, whereas calling someone a slur who's in like a privileged position wouldn't do that as much.
So I kind of agree with this, but I would kind of look at the overall climate of where we at in public discourse, and I think I would actually use that system or power thing to say, okay, maybe this is a reason then why we shouldn't be doing this anymore. It seems to be the case that this kind of like anti-white discourse, where it used to be kind of like a meme like 5 years ago, definitely 10 years ago, but I would say that over the past like year, it's become a lot more normalized to just outwardly and blatantly shit on white people, and everybody just kind of sees it as like funny and acceptable humor. But as our political climate gets more and more divisive, I think that we're now in a case where you can legitimately be made to feel like alienated or feel otherized because you're white, and that's kind of an acceptable thing. I think we should push back on that. Is kind of what I'm looking like. Like 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 40 years ago, calling somebody a cracker is like, who the fuck cares? Like these days on social media, you can legitimately have people like saying things like, we need to kill all white people. And it's like, that's kind of insane. There's not really like a public pushback from it. Sometimes we get banned because of TOS, but nobody really talks about it. Because we always hear that saying like, well, systemic. And it's like, okay, I don't know if individuals feel that way though.
Do you think there's like a legitimate push by people on the left that they actually do have like eugenics viewpoints, or think that like people who aren't white are like genetically superior to white people, or like what do you think? Because to me, I have always just seen it as a kind of a meme, like you're saying. I guess I haven't noticed this big systemic shift necessarily, because in my opinion, like I would agree if there's someone who is like a legitimate like black supremacist or something, who legitimately believes that like the black race is superior and they're going around calling people cracker, I would say like that's a bad thing and they shouldn't be doing that. But if it is something where like from my perspective, it seems like the most people are just like the majority of people are just kind of memeing it still, you know?
Yeah, so that's where I was basically. So I don't know, let me go with myself. Like 4 or 5, I'd say like 2 or 3 years ago, I used to use like the white jokes a lot because I thought they were funny. Like, oh my god, that's white, you're white as fuck. And stuff like this would really trigger the fuck out of people. And I thought it was funny. But I think with like most forms of racial humor, I started to find it less funny when it felt like people legitimately started to feel that way. So you mentioned like black nationalism or black supremacy. It feels like as far as social media goes, you can find a lot of defense for people that are black nationalists, and even some defense, not as much, but some defense for people that are black supremacists. And you get into this weird world where like these people have a space and they can have conversations, and we're supposed to understand them and why they exist. But like if it was ever a white supremacist, like the obvious answer is immediately like this person is horrible and we don't accept this at all, and it's like not something that we should ever tolerate. So I think that feels a little bit strange.
Yeah, and I agree with you. It can be hard to like know the motivation behind like why someone is saying something, but I think that sometimes like when people of color do like lash out and use slurs, it's like because they're upset with racism that they've experienced. So if they're like, oh, I hate white people because they're so racist towards me, that would be different than like, oh, I hate white people because we need to cleanse the world of white people or something. You know?
Yeah, so the problem with that is that, like, there's two huge problems with that. On one end, it kind of, like, dehumanizes minorities, in my opinion, because it's like, oh, well, sometimes if you're a minority and you have a problem with a white person, you just can't help it but be racist. That's kind of like it's just old conservative, like the bigotry of low expectations. Or a second problem that I have with that is that can justify the use of the N-word as well. Like, let's say that you have a white person and they were robbed by 2 black people, like 3 times. Like, would anybody ever use that excuse? Be like, okay, well, come on, he's had a ton of bad experiences with black people. Like, of course he's going to call him the N-word sometimes. Like, we have to be compassionate, you know? I don't think we would ever use that excuse for a white person using a racial slur.
Well, I think that the reason why you wouldn't is because it would add to.
Good work! Now keep pushing.
I can't hear what you're saying, but yeah.
Their defeat is inevitable.
When you had them, you only have to try to put the nail in.
Yeah, I'm in the middle of something at the moment, but yes, I will do that in a moment.